The morning Clara Ashford packed her belongings, the frost had already crept inside the window panes, tracing white fingers across the glass, as though the house itself was trying to hold something in. She worked by candlelight before dawn, moving without sound through rooms she had known her entire life, her hands finding each object in the dark, way hands do when they have touched something 1,000 times. The quilt her grandmother had sewn from scraps of every dress the women in her family had worn since before the war. She folded it twice, pressed it flat against her palm, and laid it at the bottom of the canvas sack. Not because it was the most practical thing to bring, because it was the only thing left that still smelled like her mother. She did not cry. She had decided that 3 weeks ago, standing at the graveside in the frozen mud of the small plot beside the apple trees her father had planted, watching men lower her mother into ground so hard the gravediggers had needed 2 days and iron picks to break through. She had made the decision the way her father had taught her to make decisions about load-bearing structures and geological formations, by looking at what was true, accepting it completely, and then calculating what came next. What was true was that Margaret Ashford was gone. What was true was that Roland Hatch had already consulted the lawyer before the funeral flowers had wilted. What was true was that this morning was coming, no matter what Clara felt about it, so she might as well be packed and ready when it arrived. Roland stood in the doorway of what had been her parents' bedroom, watching her with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a broad man, 45 years old, with a gray-streaked beard he kept trimmed in a way that it suggested he cared about appearances more than he cared about work. He had married her mother 3 years ago, when Margaret Ashford had been a widow with a farm and a daughter and a mortgage that a woman alone could not service without a man's name on the deed. Clara had understood the transaction even then at 14. Her mother had understood it too. They had never spoken of it directly, but they had understood it together the way women in difficult circumstances learn to understand the things they cannot change. The law is clear. Roland's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had already won and knew it. Your mother's will names her husband as sole heir. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the savings, everything. Clara kept folding. She pulled a wool shirt from the drawer, shook it once, folded it along the seams the way her mother had taught her. Mr. Calhoun will drive you to town at first light. After that, you are not my responsibility. She wanted to say things. She had spent 3 weeks composing them in the dark, lying in her narrow bed, listening to Roland move through the house with the comfortable familiarity of a man who believed he had earned what he had taken. She had composed entire speeches about her father, Ezra Ashford, who had built this house board by board with his own hands, who had dug the well by himself over 2 summers, who had planted those apple trees as saplings carried from Pennsylvania in wet burlap. About her mother who had kept this farm alive through drought and debt, and a grief so heavy it had taken years to lift only for Margaret to die before she could see the apple trees bear a full harvest again. About the fact that Roland Hatch had contributed nothing to this land except his name and his appetite. She said none of it. She had learned in 17 years of watching how the world actually worked that some arguments cannot be won with words, because the person on the other side of the argument has already decided the outcome. Roland had not come to the doorway to hear her. He had come to watch her accept her defeat. So she gave him nothing. No tears, no pleading, no rage he could feel superior to. She folded her wool shirt and placed it in the sack and reached for the next thing. What she was actually looking for, moving through the room with the appearance of methodical packing, was the loose board in the floor beside the window. Her father had shown it to her years ago, pressing his finger to his lips with a conspiratorial smile, lifting the board to reveal a shallow space beneath. Not deep enough for valuables, he had said, but deep enough for things worth keeping private. Clara had assumed he meant documents, perhaps the deed to the land, perhaps the surveying certificates that had taken him 2 years to earn. She had never looked inside during his lifetime, respecting the privacy of the gesture. She looked now. Roland had already found it. The space was empty except for a thin layer of dust and a dead beetle lying on its back with its legs curled. Whatever her father had kept there was gone, searched, and removed at some point in the 3 weeks since her mother's death. Roland had been thorough. She should have expected that, but he had missed the other one. The second loose board was behind the small bookcase her father had built into the wall, the one with the notched shelves sized precisely for the engineering journals he had collected throughout his career. Roland had taken the journals she had noticed their absence 2 days ago, presumably believing they had some monetary value, or perhaps simply clearing the shelves with the same sweeping efficiency he had applied to everything else. What he had not done was move the bookcase itself. It was heavy, built from the same dense pine as the walls, and Roland was a man who hired other people to lift heavy things. Clara moved to the bookcase and pressed her fingers along the bottom edge until she felt the seam. She tilted the case forward just enough, slipped her hand beneath, and found what she was looking for. The journal was thinner than she remembered, smaller than the engineering volumes Roland had taken, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp out, bound with a strip of leather her father had cut from an old belt. She did not open it. She pressed it flat against her body, tucked it beneath her wool shirt, and let the bookcase settle back against the wall without a sound. Roland was still talking from the doorway. She had stopped hearing him. The journal contained her father's personal notes, not the professional surveys he had conducted for mining companies, but his private observations. She knew this because he had read sections of it to her on winter evenings when the work was done and the fire was banked low and there was nothing left to do but think. He had written about heat, about the way the earth stored it, moved it, released it through cracks in the stone over millions of years without diminishing. He had written about the hot springs he had surveyed in the summers before Clara was born, about the thermal properties of limestone and granite, about the elegant indifference of geothermal systems that had been operating since before the first human being stood upright and felt the sun on their face. He had found it beautiful, this heat rising from below. He had found it profound. Roland had looked at a leather-bound journal full of diagrams and thermal equations and seen nothing worth keeping. Clara fastened the canvas sack and lifted it onto her shoulder. 53 cents in the bottom of her coat pocket of money she had saved from selling eggs at the general store over the past year, eggs that Roland now claimed belonged to the farm and therefore to him. She had not told him about the coins. She had carried them in her pocket for a week ready. She walked past Roland without looking at him. She heard him say something else behind her, something about gratitude or perhaps about the generosity he had shown her by giving her until morning. She did not stop to determine which. She spent the night in the barn, not because she had nowhere else to sleep. Roland had made no move to take her room, but because the barn was where she could think without being observed, and there were things she needed to think through before morning came. She climbed to the hayloft and sat with her back against the sloping wall and opened her father's journal by the light of a small lantern she had taken from the hook by the door. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun falling, the flakes small and precise, the kind that settled without drifting and meant serious cold was close behind. The journal began as it always did with observations. Her father had dated each entry, noted the location, described the conditions with the precision of a man trained to record what he saw rather than what he felt. But between the technical entries woven through the engineering notation, like a second voice, were the personal observations that had no place in a professional survey report. The beauty of a particular spring emerging from limestone at exactly the temperature of a warm bath. The sound of water moving underground, audible if you pressed your ear to the right kind of rock in the right conditions. The way heat radiated from stone that had been warmed by geothermal water for centuries, the rock itself becoming a storage system, slow to heat and slow to release. She turned to the last page. She had looked at it once briefly years ago and had closed the journal and replaced it beneath the bookcase because some things are not meant to be read until you are ready for them. She was ready now. Her father's handwriting on the final page was different from the rest, not the careful, measured script of the professional entries, but something faster, pressed harder into the paper, the letters leaning forward as though the words were in a hurry. Clara, if you are reading this page, something has gone wrong and I am not there to help you. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for whatever circumstances have brought you to this page in the dark. But I need you to listen to me now the way you listened when we worked through problems together at the kitchen table, without panic, without giving up before you have found the answer. The earth does not stop giving heat because winter comes. The winter is only what happens on the surface. Below, the heat continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to the season. You are my daughter. You understand how heat moves. Use that. She read it 3 times. Then she closed the journal, carefully wrapped it back in the oilcloth, and tucked it into the deepest part of the canvas sack where it would be protected from moisture. She lay back in the hay and listened to the snow falling against the barn roof and thought about heat moving through stone, and sometime before dawn she slept. Mr. Calhoun arrived at first light with his wagon and his silence. He was a neighbor who had known the Ashford family since before Clara was born, a quiet man who kept his opinions inside himself the way certain geological formations keep their heat thoroughly and for a very long time. He loaded her single bag without meeting her eyes. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that lingered half a second longer than necessary, a gesture that contained an entire apology he could not speak aloud, because speaking it would have cost him something he could not afford to lose. They drove the 6 miles to Copper Creek without exchanging a word. The landscape on either side of the frozen road was the pale gray of early winter. The grasses flattened the creek that gave the town its name, running low and dark between ice-edged banks. Clara watched it all with the attention of someone memorizing things they are not sure they will see again. At the edge of town, just before he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Harding's General Store, Mr. Calhoun reached into his coat pocket and pressed something into her hand without looking at her. 25 cents, 2 dimes, and a nickel warm from being carried close to his body. His jaw worked for a moment, and what came out was quiet enough that the horse's breath nearly covered it. I'm ashamed of myself, Clara. I want you to know that. She looked at the coins in her palm. She looked at the side of his face, the set of his shoulders, the hands holding the reins with unnecessary tightness. She understood that he was telling the truth and that the truth was the only thing he had to offer. I know, she said. Thank you for the ride. He drove away without looking back. She understood that too. 78 cents now. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of Harding's and watched the town begin its morning. The boarding house across the street wanted 75 cents a night. She knew this because she had delivered eggs to Mrs. Fowler, who ran it, and Mrs. Fowler had mentioned the rate once as a casual reference point, the way people mention prices when they are not thinking about who might someday need to know them. The church offered charity, but charity from Reverend Polk meant working for his cousin, Widow Hartley, who had a well-documented history of working her charity cases past the point of usefulness and then turning them out in spring no better off than they had arrived. The temperature was dropping. The sky had gone the color of dirty iron, pressing down on the town from all sides, the kind of sky that meant the snow from last night was only the beginning of a longer conversation. Clara stood with her canvas sack at her feet and ran through her options with the same systematic process her father had used to evaluate site conditions before committing to a survey location. She listed what she had. She listed what she needed. She calculated the gap between the two and looked for any available resource she had not yet accounted for. She was still running this calculation when the voice came from behind her. "You're Daniel Ashford's girl." The woman sitting on the bench outside the store was very old, 70 or thereabouts, wrapped in furs that had seen decades of hard use. Her white hair pinned beneath a wool cap that had been repaired so many times the repairs had their own repairs. She was watching Clara with eyes that did not match the rest of her age eyes, that were sharp and still and precise as the blade of a well-kept knife. "He's been gone 6 years, Clara said. 6 years this coming February." The old woman nodded slowly as though confirming something she had suspected. "I counted. Good man your father. Fixed something for me once when nobody else would touch it. Didn't ask for a single thing in return." She looked at the canvas sack at Clara's coat, which was good wool but not good enough for what was coming, at the particular quality of stillness and that Clara had been maintaining since she climbed down from Calhoun's wagon. That man your mother married, he throw you out. He says the will is clear. The law agrees with him. Law being right and law being just are two different animals. The old woman stood with the careful economy of someone who had learned over many decades that unnecessary movement was a form of waste. She moved like a person who had decided long ago that energy spent without purpose was energy that could not be spent when it mattered. Name's Agnes Pruitt. I've lived in these hills longer than most people in this town have been drawing breath. Clara met those sharp eyes directly. Clara Ashford. Agnes studied her for a long moment with the unhurried attention of someone conducting a genuine assessment. Then without preamble, you got somewhere to be tonight. Not yet. You got money for a room. 78 cents. Agnes absorbed this without visible reaction. Come with me. I want to show you something. She began moving toward the western edge of town, toward the hills that rose dark and pine-thick against the iron sky, and she did not look back to see if Clara was following. If someone had told Clara that morning while she was lying in her father's hayloft reading his last words that she would end the day walking into a Montana forest behind a stranger, she would have assessed the proposition with the same calm she applied to everything. She would have noted the risks. There were real ones. She was not naive, and she would have noted the alternative, which was a wooden sidewalk, a dropping temperature, and 78 cents. She followed because Agnes Pruitt had spoken her father's name with a particular quality of respect that Clara had heard before only from people who had actually known him. And because the old woman had not offered charity or pity or a speech about the Lord's provision. She had offered something without explaining what it was. People who had something real to offer rarely needed to describe it first. The trail into the hills was invisible until you were already on it. Agnes moved through the pines and aspens with the ease of someone navigating their own house, never pausing to check direction, never hesitating at a fork. Clara kept pace, adjusting her bag across her shoulder, watching the terrain the way her father had taught her to watch it, not just the surface, but what the surface suggested about what lay beneath. The slope was limestone country. Here she could see it in the outcroppings, in the way the drainage cut certain patterns through the hillside. Limestone meant caves. Limestone meant water moving through rock in ways that were not visible from the surface. Your father was an engineer. Agnes spoke without turning, her breath coming out in small clouds in the cold air. Surveying work. He understood the earth. He taught me what he could. He wrote things down. It was not quite a question. Clara's hand moved involuntarily toward the canvas sack, toward the shape of the oilcloth-wrapped journal inside. He kept a journal. Agnes was quiet for a moment, navigating a section of trail that had iced overnight, her steps placed with deliberate precision. He surveyed these hills 15 years ago, maybe 16. I know because he came through here in the summer working a contract for one of the mining companies. She paused at a particular outcropping of pale rock and looked at it the way Clara's father used to look at geological features, with recognition rather than curiosity, the look of someone seeing something they already knew. He found things in these hills that the mining company didn't care about, didn't fit their purpose. What kind of things? Agnes looked at her over her shoulder. The kind that keep a person alive in winter without burning a cord of wood. They walked for 2 hours. The last of the daylight had gone thin and gray by the time Agnes stopped at what appeared to be a natural fall of rock on the hillside. A tumble of limestone slabs half hidden behind a growth of dead brush, arranged with a naturalness that Clara's eye, trained by years of watching her father assess site conditions, recognized as deliberate. Someone had placed that brush. The randomness was too consistent to be accidental. Agnes pulled the brush aside without ceremony, revealing an opening in the hillside approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the edges worn smooth by water and time. Darkness beyond, and from the darkness, warmth, not the sharp, dry warmth of a fire, but something softer, more pervasive, the warmth of air that had been held at a constant temperature for a very long time. I found this place 40 years ago, Agnes said. Told nobody. Too useful to share with people who'd ruin it. The tunnel was narrow and ran straight into the hill for perhaps 30 feet, the walls smooth and pale in the dimness, before it opened without warning into a space that made Clara stop walking and stand very still. The chamber was large, 40 feet across, at least the ceiling, arching 20 feet overhead, in a curve that reminded her of the drawings of cathedrals she had seen in one of her father's books. The floor was flat stone, worn to something approaching smoothness by water that had moved through here over centuries and then gradually retreated. And at the center of the chamber, a pool perhaps 8 feet across breathed a steady column of steam into the cool cave air. The water surface moved in small, slow patterns that had nothing to do with wind or current. They were the patterns of heat rising of water in constant, gentle motion from below. Clara walked to the edge of the pool and held her open hand 12 inches above the surface. The heat rose against her palm in a wave that was steady and absolutely consistent, the temperature of a warm bath. And she understood immediately and completely what she was looking at, because her father had written about it in his journal, and she had read those pages enough times to have them memorized. Geothermal. The word came out almost without her intending it. The water comes up from deep in the formation, picks up thermal energy from the rock below, carries it to the surface. She straightened and looked up at the cathedral ceiling, reading it the way her father had taught her to read geological features as records of process, not just structures. The cave acts as an insulator. The limestone holds the heat from the water and releases it slowly into the air. The ventilation shaft, she located it by the movement of steam, a narrowing in the ceiling toward the back of the chamber, keeps the humidity from building to the point of discomfort. Agnes watched her without expression for a long moment. Then quietly, "Your father taught you well." "He taught me to understand how things work." Agnes moved to a boulder near the pool and sat with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about cold and damp. She pulled her furs tighter. The warmth in the cave was working on her visibly, the set of her shoulders easing her breathing, slowing. "I was in a mine shaft 20 miles east of here, 15 years ago. Roof came down, timber and rock buried me in the dark." Her voice was even reporting facts, the voice of someone who had processed this story thoroughly over many years. "I was there 3 days before anyone found me. Your father was surveying the mine for the company that owned it. Had no business being anywhere near the collapsed section." Clara looked at her. She did not speak. "He heard me. Said later he heard my voice coming up through a crack in the formation. Sound travels through limestone differently than through open air, if you understand the acoustics. Most people wouldn't have known to listen for it." Agnes looked at the pool, at the steam rising steady and unhurried. "He spent 18 hours getting me out. Said he understood the structure, knew which timbers he could move, and which ones were holding the weight. He was right. Nothing else came down." She paused. "When I asked him what I owed him, he said the world only works when people look out for each other. Said that was payment enough." The cave was very quiet. Somewhere deep in the limestone water moved through channels carved over millennia, picking up heat from the Earth's core and carrying it toward the surface in an endless slow cycle that had nothing to do with seasons or money or the intentions of Roland Hatch. "You're paying a debt," Clara said. "I'm showing you a cave." Agnes stood moving through the chamber with the familiarity of someone who had spent real time here, pointing out the sleeping area near the wall where the rock radiated strongest, the storage alcove in the back, where the air was drier and the temperature more stable, the cool edge of the pool where the water was safe to drink. "What you do with it is your business. I'm 71 years old. I'm not going to use this place much more. Someone should know about it. Someone who will actually understand what it is." She pointed at different features as she spoke, the way the heat gradient worked across the chamber strongest at the pool's edge and diminishing toward the walls, but never dropping below the mid-50s even at the farthest points. The specific composition of the rock, which her father had written about limestone's exceptional capacity to absorb and slowly release thermal energy, turning the cave walls themselves into a kind of storage radiator. Agnes knew these things not from journals, but from decades of direct observation from winters spent in this chamber when circumstances left her no better option. "What's the temperature in here?" Clara asked. 57, 58 degrees, year-round. The spring never changes, water comes up at 104. Keeps the air consistent regardless of what's happening outside. Coldest winter I spent in here, 1862, temperature outside went to 40 below and stayed for 3 weeks. In here it never dropped below 56. Agnes paused near the tunnel entrance preparing to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow. Bring canvas for the entrance, some rope tools. After that, you're on your own." Clara looked at the chamber. At the pool, steady and warm, the steam rising in the same patient column it had been rising in for longer than any human history in this territory. At the walls, pale limestone holding 40 years of accumulated warmth. At the ceiling, its cathedral curve, the ventilation shaft dark above. At the sleeping area, Agnes had indicated the rock there warmer than the rest of the wall, heated from inside by proximity to the water table below. She thought about her father's journal entry. "The earth does not stop giving heat because winter comes. The winter is only what happens on the surface." "Why me?" she asked the question, to Agnes's back to the old woman already moving toward the tunnel. "Of all the people you could have repaid this debt to." Agnes stopped without turning. "Because your father saved my life with knowledge, not muscle. And I heard what Roland Hatch said when he filed that will with Anne Court, heard it from someone who was there. He said Daniel Ashford left nothing worth having." She turned her head just enough that Clara could see the sharp profile of her face in the dim light. "I wanted to prove him wrong." Then she was gone. The sound of her footsteps fading down the tunnel, the scrape of brush being pulled back across the entrance, and Clara was alone in a chamber that had been waiting patient as limestone for someone who needed it. She moved in that night. She worked in the dim light, filtering down through the ventilation shaft, arranging her few possessions with the systematic logic her father had applied to every problem, not where things felt right, but where the physics dictated they should go. The oilcloth journal went into the storage alcove, where the air was driest. The food she had, precious little of it, went into the coolest section of the alcove where the temperature was stable enough to slow spoilage without freezing. Her bedding went down near the pool's edge on the flat rock that absorbed heat from the water, moving below and released it through the night. In a slow, steady radiation her body would draw on while she slept. She sat for a long time with the journal open across her knees, reading, by the soft luminescence of steam-diffused light, the pages her father had filled with observation and wonder. He had written about the specific heat capacity of water, its remarkable ability to carry thermal energy vast distances without losing much of it to the surrounding rock. He had written about convection, about how heat moved through fluids in predictable patterns that could be mapped and utilized. He had written about the geothermal surveys he had conducted in Wyoming and Montana, about springs that emerged at temperatures ranging from lukewarm to near boiling, each one a manifestation of the same process operating at different depths and through different geological formations. He had written about a cave she realized reading a passage she had not focused on before. Not this cave specifically, but a type limestone chambers near active geothermal features, natural insulation combined with a constant heat source. The conditions for what he called in his precise engineering language, a passive thermal system of exceptional efficiency. He had noted that such a space properly utilized could maintain habitable temperatures through any winter on record in the territories without requiring any fuel input from the occupants. He had known such places existed. He had understood exactly how they worked, and he had written it all down and hidden the journal under a bookcase, and Roland Hatch had looked at a man's life's work and seen nothing worth keeping. Clara felt something settle in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite determination, but some combination of the two that had no simple name. She thought about the last page of the journal, the letter her father had written to her, Directly, the words pressed hard into the paper. She thought about Agnes Pruitt spending 18 hours in a collapsed mine shaft in the dark, surviving on the sound of one man's voice telling her where he would move next and why it was safe. She thought about her mother's hands in her hair every night until the sickness made lifting the brush impossible. She thought about Roland Hatch standing in her parents' doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, explaining how the law worked. She built a small fire at the cave entrance, where the smoke would travel up through the ventilation shaft and out into the cold Montana night without filling the chamber. She boiled water from the cool edge of the pool, which Agnes had confirmed was safe, and she ate the last of the food she had brought from the farmhouse. Not much a heel of bread, a few dried apple slices, and she calculated what she had and what she needed and how long 78 cents would last if she was careful. The sleeping area was exactly what her father's thermal equations had predicted. The rock beneath her retained heat from the geothermal water moving below it, releasing that heat slowly through the hours of darkness so that she lay on a surface that stayed consistently warmer than the air her body drawing on that warmth, the way a person draws warmth from another person sleeping beside them. The pool nearby kept the air humid and comfortable, preventing the dry cold that made temperatures feel worse than they measured. She was warm in a way she had not expected to be warm, not the sharp warmth of a fire that required constant feeding and died the moment you stopped tending it, but the deep, even warmth of something that had been running without human intervention for geological ages and would continue doing so long after she was gone. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Agnes returned the next morning as promised, arriving at the cave entrance before Clara had finished eating the small breakfast she had prepared, dried meat softened in hot spring water, which emerged from the process tasting better than it had any right to. The old woman brought canvas, heavy and good quality, along with rope, a frame of cut branches, and strips of cured hide for sealing gaps. She also brought a knife with a handle worn smooth from years of use, a coil of snare wire, and something else information. Roland Hatch was in town yesterday afternoon, Agnes said, setting down her load near the entrance with efficient movements. Asking questions at the general store, wanting to know if anyone had seen you where you might be staying. What did people say? Nothing helpful to him. Most people in this town owe Roland a debt of one kind or another. He's been strategic about that, lending small amounts, doing small favors, building up a credit of obligation he can call in when he needs it. Agnes began sorting the materials, organizing them with the practiced economy of someone who had done this many times in many circumstances. But owing a man money isn't the same as caring what happens to his stepdaughter. People kept their mouths shut because they had nothing useful to say, not out of loyalty to you. Don't mistake the one for the other. I won't. He also talked to a man named Cole Varner. Agnes said the name without particular emphasis, the way you state a weather condition, not alarming in itself, just a fact that affects your plans. Varner does tracking work when he can get it, hired by people who need to find things they've lost track of or people they want to locate. Roland mentioned to Varner that he believed you might have taken something from the farm before you left. Something valuable. Clara looked up from the snare wire she was examining. I took my own belongings, my grandmother's quilt, my father's journal, which Roland didn't consider worth keeping, my clothes. I know that. Agnes met her eyes steadily. Roland doesn't. Or rather, Roland has decided to believe something else because believing something else is more useful to him. He's convinced himself that Daniel Ashford left some kind of treasure gold from the mining surveys, perhaps, or maps that lead to something worth finding. He thinks you know where it is. Clara thought about her father, about the man who had taught her to read geological formations and had kept his personal journal under a bookcase and had spent 18 hours digging a stranger out of a collapsed mine because the world only worked when people looked out for each other. The man who had worked for wages his entire career and saved what he could and left it all to his wife and daughter in a will that Roland Hatch had replaced with a forgery. My father never had any treasure. He was an engineer. I know what your father was. Agnes said it quietly without any inflection that required a response. What matters is that Roland has hired Varner to find you, and Varner is good at what he does. He won't move quickly. He's methodical, not impulsive, but he'll start narrowing possibilities. You need to cover your tracks when you go to town. Vary your route. Don't let anyone follow you back to this place. Clara nodded, absorbing this the way she absorbed the thermal calculations in her father's journal completely without resistance, integrating it into her understanding of the situation and adjusting her plans accordingly. She had not been naive enough to think that simply surviving the winter was the whole problem. She had known in a general way that Roland would not simply let the matter of her continued existence rest. This was more specific than she had expected this soon, but it was not surprising. Varner is the first layer, she said. What happens after him? Agnes looked at her with something that might have been approval, the look of someone who asks similar kinds of questions. That depends on what he finds and what he reports. If he finds nothing, Roland may lose interest. He has other problems. The winter is already costing him more than he budgeted. She paused, fitting a branch into the frame she was assembling. I heard from the lumberyard man that Roland burned through his first 10 cords faster than expected. The farmhouse leaks heat the way bad mine shafts leak water from everywhere at once, and always worse than you think. Clara thought about the farmhouse she had been born in, the windows her father had fitted himself, but which had never been properly resealed after a bad winter 3 years ago, shifted the frame. The floorboards in the north bedroom that had always let cold air up from the crawl space below. She had grown up in that house knowing its thermal weaknesses the way she knew the names of her neighbors. Roland had walked into it in September and spent his first winter discovering them one by one as they cost him money. He'll burn through everything my mother saved, Clara said, not with satisfaction, as a statement of thermal mechanics applied to human circumstances. Agnes did not disagree. She kept working, fitting the canvas to the branch frame with the practiced movements of someone who had done this or something very like it before. Over the next 3 days, she taught not with lectures, but with demonstration and question, the Socratic method applied to survival. She showed Clara how to set snares in the hills around the cave, placing them not randomly, but at the specific points where rabbit movement was most predictable, given the terrain and the location of food sources. She identified the edible plants that could still be found or dug in early winter, the inner bark of certain trees that could be prepared into something approaching nutrition, the difference between safe and dangerous water sources in this particular limestone country. She showed Clara how to use the hot spring itself as a cooking apparatus. The water at the pool's edge, just a few degrees below the center temperature, was hot enough to soften dried meat, to cook eggs, to heat liquids without any fire at all. The earth did the cooking. You brought the ingredients. On the third day, they built the entrance seal together, the branch frame fitted with canvas, the gaps closed with hide strips, the whole assembly arranged to open and close without losing significant heat from the chamber. When they tested it, sealing the entrance and sitting quietly for 20 minutes, the temperature in the chamber did not drop a single measurable degree. Agnes sat beside the pool and looked at what they had made. When the real cold comes, you seal this at night. Keep the warm air in. The cave becomes a closed system. She looked at Clara. You understand closed systems? My father wrote about them. Then you understand that what you put in, you get back. And this spring has been putting heat into this cave for longer than either of us will live. You're not generating warmth. You're just learning to stay inside what's already here. On the morning of the fourth day, Agnes prepared to leave. She stood at the entrance with her coat buttoned and her furs arranged, and looked at Clara with those sharp eyes that had been watching and assessing since the first moment on the bench outside Harding's general store. I'm 71 years old, she said. Winters are getting harder. I may not be able to come back as often as I'd like. If I don't come when you expect me. She paused, and in the pause was everything she was not going to say about age and cold, and the particular difficulty of mountain trails in deep winter. Don't go looking for me. Stay warm, stay fed, stay hidden. I understand. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. The steam from the pool rose between them, steady and patient. Your father would be proud of you. The way you walked into this cave and read it like a text. The way you didn't waste time being frightened of what you didn't know yet. She reached into her coat and produced a small, folded piece of paper. If something happens to me this winter, you'll find a letter in my cabin behind the loose stone in the fireplace. It contains information you may need. Don't look for it unless you have to. Clara took the paper, which turned out to be a rough map of the hills around the Cave Key landmarks, marked in Agnes's careful handwriting. She looked at it and then looked at Agnes. What kind of information? The kind that matters. Agnes pulled the brush screen back across the entrance from outside. Her voice came through the canvas and hide slightly muffled. The earth keeps you warm, Clara. Everything else you have to earn. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hillside, growing fainter against the frozen ground, and then the forest absorbed them completely. Clara stood alone in the cave with the pool steaming beside her and the journal in her hands, and 78 cents she no longer had any immediate use for, and outside the first real cold of winter was settling over the Montana territory, with the patient, comprehensive intention of something that had been doing this for a very long time and knew exactly how to finish what it started. She opened her father's journal to the first page and began reading from the beginning. She had read it before many times, but she had never read it as the only person responsible for her own survival in a cave that would keep her alive exactly as long as she understood how to use it, and not one day longer. The words looked different now. Everything her father had written, every observation about heat transfer and thermal gradients, and the specific behavior of water moving through limestone, looked like something he had written for this exact moment, this exact reader, this exact situation, which she understood now reading the last page again in the glow of geothermal steam and pale limestone walls was precisely what it was. The winter had begun. Clara Ashford was ready for it. November came in hard and stayed. The cold that settled over the Montana territory in the first week of that month was not the tentative cold of autumn's end, but something with weight and intention behind it, the kind that moved into the landscape, the way a serious occupant moves into a house, rearranging everything, making clear it planned to stay. Clara felt it each morning when she pulled the canvas seal aside to check the world outside the air, hitting her face like a flat palm, the temperature already well below freezing, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridgeline. Inside the cave, the thermometer Agnes had left hung steady at 58 degrees. Outside, the world was becoming a different country. She built her days around the logic of conservation. Every action she took was evaluated against a simple question her father had applied to engineering problems, and that translated perfectly to survival. What is the most efficient use of available resources to achieve the required outcome? She did not wander. She did not experiment without reason. She moved through the hills around the cave in patterns calculated to gather maximum food with minimum exposure, minimum tracks, minimum evidence of her presence in any particular location. She set her snare lines in 3 concentric rings at increasing distances from the cave entrance, rotating which ring she checked each day so that no single approach path became worn enough to be visible from a distance. The rabbits came regularly in the first weeks. The cold had driven them down from the high country into the lower brush, where food was marginally more available, and they were not yet wary of the snares in the way animals become wary after sustained pressure. Clara learned their patterns, the specific runs they used at specific hours, the way they moved differently on clear nights versus overcast ones, the micro-terrain features that funneled them towards certain locations as reliably as water following a drainage channel. Her father had written nothing specific about rabbit behavior, but he had written extensively about pattern recognition in complex systems, about how any system operating under consistent physical laws will develop predictable behaviors if you observe it long enough and carefully enough. Rabbits were a system operating under consistent physical laws. She brought her first catch back to the cave entrance and prepared it with the knife Agnes had given her, working efficiently in the cold, and cooked the meat in the hot spring water at the pool's edge. The result was plain but genuinely nourishing the heat from the earth doing the work, without requiring her to build a fire or spend fuel she didn't have. She ate slowly, noting the warmth spreading through her body from the inside, and calculated how many rabbits per week she needed to maintain her body weight against the caloric demands of cold weather physical work. The number was achievable. The math was on her side for now. She went into town in the first week of December when her flour supply had dropped to a level that made the trip necessary. She traded 4 rabbit pelts at the general store for flour and salt, and a small amount of dried beans, conducting the transaction with the efficiency of someone who had other things to do and no interest in conversation. The people in Harding's store watched her with the particular quality of attention that Copper Creek had been directing at her since October, the attention of a community that had expected one outcome and received another, that had assumed a 17-year-old girl thrown out in autumn would be desperate by winter, and was still waiting for the desperation to arrive. She was loading the flour into her bag when the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen street made several people in the store move to the window. She did not move to the window. She continued loading her bag. She already knew from the quality of the silence that fell over the store and the particular way the clerk behind the counter straightened his spine who had just arrived. Roland Hatch pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the hardware store across the street. He was wearing her father's furs. She recognized the particular color and cut of the beaver pelt coat Daniel Ashford had worn on cold weather surveys, the coat that had hung on the hook beside the farmhouse door for as long as Clara could remember. It was too large across the shoulders for Roland, who was a bigger man in the body, but smaller somehow in the way he occupied space, and he moved inside it with the stiffness of someone who had spent too much time near inadequate heat sources. His face was redder than it should have been for a man who claimed to have 2 stoves. He crossed the street and came into the general store, and the moment he saw Clara, his expression moved through surprise and settled into something that wanted to be contempt, but had something else underneath it. Something that looked, if you were watching carefully, like relief. Like a man who needed her to be worse off than she was, and was disturbed to find she wasn't. Still alive. The words came out with the specific lightness of someone who had rehearsed indifference. I expected the cold would have settled that by now. Clara shouldered her bag. She looked at him directly the way she had looked at him from across the bedroom doorway on the morning she left, not challenging, not flinching, simply present in a way that gave him nothing useful. I'm managing. Where you sleep in Charity House, one of the cribs behind the saloon. The store was very quiet, 8 people finding reasons to examine merchandise they had no intention of buying. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cave's geothermal system. The warmth of knowing something the man in front of her could not know and would not be able to stand knowing. Her father had written about thermodynamics, about how systems seek equilibrium, about how heat always flows from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration until balance is achieved. Roland had taken everything from her and stood here in a dead man's coat, believing he was the warmer system. He was burning through that warmth at a rate he didn't understand yet. She smiled, not to wound him though it would, because the smile was simply true. I have a place, warm enough, warmer than yours probably. Roland's face tightened. My house has proper stoves, 2 of them. I've already burned through more wood than I budgeted for, but I am comfortable. That sounds expensive. The tightening spread from his face to his jaw, to the set of his shoulders inside the borrowed coat. He had expected something from this encounter, tears perhaps, or the visible signs of suffering. He needed to confirm that the natural order had been restored. He had not expected a smile. He had not expected comfortable. He left the store without buying what he had come for, and Clara watched through the window as he climbed back into his wagon and drove north toward the farm that had been her home, and she felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She felt the precise, calibrated awareness of someone watching a system burn through its reserves at an unsustainable rate. She took a longer route back to the hills. She had been doing this since Agnes warned her about coal Varner, Never the same path twice in sequence, always adding an extra mile of lateral movement to break any trail she had started developing, always pausing at high points to observe the terrain behind her before descending toward the cave entrance. She saw nothing on the hillsides that shouldn't have been there. She heard nothing that wasn't wind in the creak of pine trees contracting in the cold. She was thorough because thoroughness was cheaper than in the alternative. Agnes came in the third week of January. She arrived before dawn, which was itself a statement about the conditions the old woman had timed her approach for the dark hours, when anyone watching the hills would have less visibility, a calculation that told Clara Agnes was taking the Varner threat seriously. She brought dried meat, a wool blanket worn thin at the edges, but still functional, and news that rearranged the shape of everything Clara had been planning. Roland went to the county courthouse in late December. Agnes settled near the pool, letting the heat work on her joints, which the cold had clearly been working against. He was looking at property records, deed transfers, that kind of thing. But while he was there, he apparently had a conversation with the clerk about estate filings, about the process by which wills are recorded, and what happens if a discrepancy is found after the fact. Clara watched her. He's worried. He's worried because he should be. Agnes accepted the cup of hot spring water Clara had prepared, wrapping both hands around it. The clerk mentioned to his wife, who mentioned it at the church social, that Roland seemed very interested in understanding whether a will once probated could be challenged after the fact. What grounds would be required? What evidence would need to exist? The fire that had always burned under Clara's understanding of her situation, low and controlled, never allowed to become something that interfered with clear thinking, burned a degree hotter. Roland was asking about challenges because he feared one. He feared one because something existed that could support one. He didn't destroy everything. There was a lawyer, Agnes said, carefully watching Clara's face. A man named Harold Kemp. He was practicing in Billings before he moved. I say moved because I believe he's still alive, still working, though. He'd be getting on in years now. He drew up your mother's real will. He would remember its contents. The name landed with the weight of something genuinely important. Clara repeated it in her mind, fixing it Harold Kemp Billings, the man who had put her mother's actual intentions into legal language. If he testified to what the will contained, it wouldn't be proof on its own. A lawyer's memory against a filed document with the original apparently gone. Agnes set down the cup. But combined with other evidence, a witness to the real will's contents, perhaps documentation that Roland was aware of it before it disappeared, it might be enough to make a case. She paused. I was a witness, the signing. I watched your mother write her name. The cave was very quiet except for the water moving in the pool. Clara understood what Agnes was telling her, and understood also the weight of what it meant for a 71-year-old woman in poor health to place herself as a witness in a legal dispute against Roland Hatch, who had money and connections and 3 years of carefully cultivated obligations from half the people in Copper Creek. That's dangerous for you. Most things worth doing are. Agnes stood, preparing to make the cold journey back down the hill. Keep Harold Kemp's name. Keep the thought of Billings. When winter breaks, when the railroad is running again, there may be a path forward that doesn't require anything except evidence and the courage to use it. She moved toward the entrance and then stopped. One more thing. Varner has been working the Eastern Ridge. I heard from someone who saw him. He's methodical grid patterns, searching the way a professional works. He hasn't come this far west yet, but he's narrowing. You may have a month before he reaches this ridge. After she left, Clara sat with the information, the way her father sat with complex survey data, not reacting to it immediately, but turning it over, examining each element, understanding how the pieces related to each other. Harold Kemp and Billings. Agnes as witness. Varner coming from the east. Roland burning through his wood supply at a rate that was eating through what her mother had saved. She was not just surviving the winter anymore. She was without having chosen this moment to begin preparing to fight. The wolves came in January's last week, precisely when the temperature dropped to 30 below, and stayed there. She heard them for 2 nights before they found her snare lines, a sound that traveled through the frozen air with extraordinary clarity, the howling of animals past the point of patience, hunting with the focused desperation of creatures who had run out of easier options. On the third morning, she walked her nearest snare ring and found it destroyed. Not sprung destroyed, the wire torn the bait, consumed wolf tracks, pressed deep into the snow, in a pattern that told a clear story. They had spent time here investigating thoroughly, and they would come back. She reset the snares a quarter-mile further from the cave. The next morning, the same. They had followed her, or rather, they had followed the logic of her movement, the trails she had made over weeks of checking snare lines, and now they understood her patterns better than she had understood theirs. She reset again another quarter-mile. The morning after that, she stood at the edge of her farthest ring and counted wolf tracks and understood that she was not dealing with a random pack moving through, but with animals that had identified her operation and were systematically dismantling it. She recalculated. Without the snares producing reliably, her food supply had 19 days of margin, not quite 3 weeks. The cave kept her warm without any fuel cost, which was an enormous advantage, but warmth did not feed her. She needed protein, and she needed it consistently, and the wolves had claimed the territory in which she had been operating. She could fight them directly, which was a losing proposition. She had a knife, and they had numbers and the cold on their side. She could trap them, which required equipment she didn't have. She could relocate her snare operation to a completely different area, which would cost time and energy she needed to spend carefully. Or she could make them leave. She found the relevant passage in her father's journal on the 9th day of the wolf siege, the day her food supply dropped below the 14-day threshold, and she allowed herself for the first time to calculate what dying of starvation actually felt like. Her father had been surveying a mining claim in Wyoming. She could tell from the landscape descriptions and had noted the behavior of a wolf pack near a geothermal feature. The sulfur content of certain hot spring outputs, he had written, was sufficient to function as a territorial deterrent to large predators. Wolves avoided areas with strong sulfurous odors, not from any learned aversion, but from the same deep instinctual logic that made them avoid fire. The smells signaled conditions hostile to life, and their survival depended on not investigating such conditions too closely. The cave's pool had only a faint mineral odor barely detectable after weeks of living beside it, but Agnes's rough map showed other springs on the hillside, including 2 she had marked with small crosses and the notation, "Hot Very." Clara studied the map and identified the most likely candidate based on terrain and the geological principles. Her father had laid out a spring 2 miles north, where the formations suggested more direct connection to deeper thermal sources. She went in the early morning of the 10th day, moving through a landscape that had been simplified by cold into pure geometry: white ground, dark tree trunks, pale sky. She found the spring where the map indicated, announced by a smell that hit her from 30 yards away, like a physical presence. The water here was too hot to touch at the center and too sulfurous to drink at any temperature. The stones around its edge stained yellow and orange by mineral deposits laid down over centuries. She gathered a dozen of those stones in her bag, rocks that had absorbed years of sulfurous contact and carried the scent deep into their mineral structure. She placed the stones around the perimeter of her snare territory in a wide arc, handling them with strips of canvas to avoid transferring her own scent to the placement locations. She rebuilt the destroyed snares. She went back to the cave and waited. 4 days. The wolves tested the perimeter twice. She could track their approach and retreat in the snow. The careful investigation followed by the abrupt withdrawal. On the 5th morning, their tracks stopped at the sulfur stone line and turned back. On the 6th morning, there were no new tracks at all. They had moved on, finding the cost-benefit calculation of this particular hunting ground no longer favorable. She ate well that night for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. She was thinner than she had been in October, her coat hanging differently, her belt moved in 2 notches. But she was not starving, and she was not defeated, and the wolves were gone. Her father had saved her again from 12 years in the past, through words written in a Wyoming field about the smell of sulfur and the behavior of animals operating on instinct in a landscape that also operated on instinct, both of them subject to the same physical laws, both of them readable if you understood the language. It was while she was eating, sitting near the pool in the warmth that had never wavered through the entire siege, that she registered the marks in the snow near the cave entrance. She had come in from the north, from the direction of the sulfur spring, and had entered the cave without circling to check the approach from the south, which was her usual practice, and which she had abandoned because she was tired and hungry, and the wolves were gone, and she had allowed herself a moment of reduced vigilance. The marks were boot prints, not her own, which were a different size, a different tread pattern. Someone had approached the cave entrance from the south and stood there for some time, long enough to leave a cluster of overlapping impressions before moving away again toward the eastern ridge. The prints were several hours old. The person was gone, but they had found the entrance or had come close enough to it to matter. She did not sleep well that night. Edmund Farley arrived on a Tuesday in early February, though Clara did not know it was a Tuesday because she had stopped tracking days of the week in November, finding the division arbitrary in a life organized around temperature and food supply and the behavior of animals. She knew it was February by the quality of the light coming down through the ventilation shaft, and she knew it was early February because the cold had not yet begun the infinitesimal daily softening that preceded March, the change so small it was almost more felt than measured. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of movement outside the entrance was different from the wind, different from the settling of frozen branches. It had the specific irregular rhythm of a human being navigating difficult terrain while managing equipment. She was on her feet with the knife in her hand before the brush screen was disturbed, positioned against the cave wall, where the shadow was deepest, where anyone entering from outside would need 30 seconds for their eyes to adjust before they could reliably locate a still figure in dark clothing. He came through the entrance and into the tunnel and then into the chamber, and he collapsed near the pool with the boneless thoroughness of a body that had spent its last reserves reaching the warmth and had nothing left to spend on remaining upright. He was young, mid-20s, she assessed, from the proportion of his features in the dim light, the absence of the weathering that added years to faces in this territory. His equipment marked him before his words did a leather transit case still strapped across his chest, the kind surveyors use for precision instruments, and beside it a map roll in a waterproof tube that had been worth protecting even while the man carrying it was half frozen. He did not see her. His eyes were closed against the warmth he was absorbing from the pool's proximity, his breathing shallow and rapid in the way of bodies working hard to generate the heat they were losing. His hands, she noticed, were badly frostbitten at the fingertips, white shading to waxy yellow. No feeling in them yet, or he would have been moving them. She watched him for a full minute before she spoke. In that minute, she assessed everything she could assess his size relative to hers, the equipment he carried and what it indicated about his profession, and therefore his likely purpose, the condition of his clothing, which showed days of hard use in the field, the absence of any weapon drawn or visible despite the fact that he had just entered an unknown space in the dark. A man expecting to find an enemy would have had a hand on something. He had both hands on his own chest, absorbing heat. "Don't move." Her voice was even, carrying only the information necessary. "Stay where you are. Let the warmth work." His eyes opened. He located her with the careful eye movement of someone trying not to move their head, identifying the voice's source and the knife in her hand in the same moment. His expression moved through confusion toward a particular quality of alertness, not panic, but the heightened attention of someone doing rapid calculation. "I'm not armed," his breath coming in visible puffs. "I'm a surveyor. I saw steam rising from the hillside and followed it. I thought it might be a cabin." "It's not a cabin." "I can see that?" A pause during which he appeared to be deciding something. "My name is Edmund Farley. I work for the Montana Mining Company. I've been caught in the open since yesterday afternoon." She did not lower the knife. "What are you surveying?" "Geothermal features. Hot springs, thermal vents, anything that might indicate subsurface mineral deposits in associated geological formations." His voice was steadier than his condition warranted, which told her something about him, either training or temperament, possibly both. I was working a grid on the eastern ridge when the temperature dropped faster than my barometer predicted. I lost my bearing in the flat light and spent the night in a snow shelter. This morning I followed the steam. Clara looked at the transit case at the map tube. Legitimate equipment carried by someone who used it regularly. The wear patterns were consistent with real field use, not recent acquisition. You study geothermal features. It's most of what I do. Then you know what this is. He looked at the pool at the cave walls at the ceiling above, with its arch and its ventilation shaft, and the recognition that moved across his face was not the surprise of a person encountering something new, but the recognition of a person encountering something they already understand. Hot spring in a limestone chamber. Passive thermal system. He looked at her differently, then something shifting in his assessment. Someone's been living here since October. His eyes moved to the organized sleeping area, the storage alcove, the cooking setup at the entrance, the details that marked this as a thought-out habitation rather than an emergency shelter. You've optimized it. The surprise in his voice, genuine, not performed. The sleeping position relative to the pool, the storage placement, whoever set this up understood the thermal gradient. My father was an engineer. He wrote about systems like this. She lowered the knife to her side, not sheathing it. Daniel Ashford. He conducted geothermal surveys across this territory before he died. The name registered in Edmund Farley's face with a force that she had not anticipated, and that rearranged her assessment of him in a single moment. His head came up from the pillow of his own arms. His eyes sharpened through the fog of cold and exhaustion into something focused and specific. Daniel Ashford, he repeated slowly. The Daniel Ashford who published survey reports on the Yellowstone Thermal Basin in 1871 and 1873. Those surveys were required reading in my training. His methodology for mapping subsurface thermal features through surface indicator analysis. The technique is still considered the most reliable approach we have. He was sitting up slightly now, his body warming enough to allow it, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on anyone's face in relation to herself since her father died, the expression of someone who finds another person genuinely, substantively interesting. You're his daughter. I've been using his work to stay alive this winter. Edmund looked around the cave with new eyes, or rather with the same eyes but a new framework for understanding what they were seeing. Every choice Clara had made in setting up the space became legible to him in a way it would not have been to most people who walked in off a Montana hillside. He could read it the way she read it, as an application of principles rather than an improvisation. The sulfur stones outside the south perimeter, he said. I saw them when I came in from the east. That's a wolf deterrent. She looked at him steadily. You came from the east. Along the ridgeline, yes. I have followed the steam source from about a mile out. He met her look without flinching. I saw the stones and recognized what they were. Took me a moment to work out why someone would place them in that specific pattern. The prints near the entrance, a few days ago. That was me. I came close, but I was moving too quickly to investigate properly. The temperature was dropping, and I needed to make distance before dark. He paused. I should have identified myself then. I understand why that was alarming. Clara thought about the 9 days she had spent under siege by the wolves, while apparently a geothermal surveyor had been working the same ridge. She thought about the boot prints she had found and the night she had not slept. She thought about her father's journals, which Edmund Farley had studied in his professional training, and which she had read by geothermal light in a cave while the worst winter in territorial history tried to kill everything it could reach. The coincidences were not, she decided, actually coincidences. They were the result of her father's work creating a long chain of effects that had not finished producing consequences. Can you walk? She asked. Not well. My feet are. I know what your feet are. She had seen frostbite before on hands and ears, and she recognized the waxy color in the particular way he was holding his weight. You need to stay off them for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. She moved to the storage alcove and began preparing what she needed for treatment. The method Agnes had shown her: gradual warming with water from the pool's cool edge, careful massage to restore circulation without damaging the tissue further. You'll stay here while you recover. When you can walk, you leave and tell no one about this place. Edmund watched her work with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had done this before. And if I can't agree to that, then you can recover in the snow. She glanced at him. But you won't, because you are not stupid, and staying here is the only outcome where you survive with all your toes. He almost smiled, the expression complicated by pain, as she began the careful process of warming his feet. Fair terms. He stayed for 2 weeks. The first 3 days he slept more than he was awake, his body spending its reserves on repair, rather than consciousness surfacing periodically to eat what Clara prepared and then subsiding again into the deep sleep of serious cold injury recovery. She worked around him, conducting her daily operations, checking snares, preparing food, maintaining the entrance seal against the cold that pressed against it from outside, with the adjustment of someone who has planned for one and must now plan for 1.5. On the 4th day, he was awake consistently, and they talked the way people talk when they are confined in a warm space while the world outside is hostile and the silence would otherwise be too heavy. He told her about his training, the 2 years of coursework in Denver, followed by a fieldwork across 3 territories. The senior surveyor who had assigned him Daniel Ashford's published reports as required reading. He described the methodology her father had developed in precise technical terms, the way Clara's father had used surface indicator analysis, the pattern of plant growth, the mineral staining on rock, the behavior of water at surface level to map what was happening hundreds of feet underground. Clara contributed the parts her father had not published: the observations in the personal journal, the thermal measurements from specific sites her father had surveyed, but never written up formally because the companies who had hired him were not interested in the theoretical dimensions of what he found. Edmund listened with the attention of someone being given something genuinely valuable, which was exactly what was happening. There's a formation 2 miles southeast of here, Edmund said on the 6th day, consulting his map roll, which had survived the cold and the snow in its waterproof tube. I was trying to reach it when the temperature dropped. Based on the surface indicators, I believe there's a substantial geothermal feature there, possibly significant enough to be commercially relevant. He looked at her. Your father surveyed this area in 1872. He wrote about the Southeast Formation, said the surface indicators suggested a deeper thermal source than this spring. She had read the relevant entries so many times she could locate specific passages from memory. He didn't complete the survey because his contract ended and the company didn't renew. He thought the formation had potential for something beyond mineral extraction. Beyond mineral extraction, Edmund repeated. What did he mean by that? Clara thought about the pipe systems her father had sketched in the margins of his personal journal. Not the technical drawings of a professional report, but the speculative sketches of a man imagining applications that didn't exist yet. Buildings heated from below, communities drawing warmth from the earth the way they drew water from wells. The radical, impractical, decades ahead of its time idea that the heat rising through the ground could be harnessed not to power minds, but to warm human lives. He thought the earth could heat homes, she said, directly, without burning fuel. Edmund was quiet for a moment, looking at the pool, at the steam at the cave walls that had maintained their temperature through 6 weeks of territorial record cold. He was right. On the 9th day, with Edmond mobile enough to move around the cave but not yet ready for outdoor conditions, he told her about Cole Varner. He did not preface it or soften it. He simply told her what he knew because she needed to know. It presented as information rather than alarm. Varner was in the saloon the night before I started the survey. Edmund's voice was level, reporting field conditions, the way a surveyor reports what the instruments say. He was drinking and talking louder than he probably intended. He told the man next to him that he was working a job for a rancher north of town, looking for a runaway stepdaughter who had supposedly taken valuables from the property. Said the rancher believed the girl knew where her father had left something worth finding. A pause. He said he'd narrowed the search to the western ridges, that the steam rising from this hillside in cold weather would be visible from the valley floor on a clear day. Clara stood at the pool's edge and processed this without visible reaction, the way she processed everything completely without resistance. He was already on the eastern ridge when you were there. Working a grid, yes. Professional methodology. He would have reached this ridge by late February under normal search conditions. Edmund met her eyes. The cold has slowed him, but he's still out there. How long gone? 2 weeks, maybe 3 depending on conditions. He hesitated, which she noticed because Edmund Farley did not habitually hesitate. I could stay. My survey is suspended until the weather breaks. The company isn't expecting reports until March. I have equipment that's useful for monitoring movement on the ridgelines, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He watched her face for a reaction she wasn't giving him. I'm not offering out of pity. You have knowledge I want to learn from. Your father's unpublished observations about this formation are professionally significant. Staying benefits me as clearly as it benefits you. Clara thought about this. She thought about the boot prints near the entrance and the 9 days of wolf seeds she had managed alone, and the 19-day food calculations she had run while exhausted and afraid. She thought about what her father had written about closed systems, that their efficiency had limits, that every system benefited from additional inputs as long as those inputs were genuine and not parasitic. She thought about Agnes's words, 2 sets of eyes. You stay until you can walk properly, she said. You contribute food gathering, watch rotation, whatever your feet allow. You keep this location to yourself, regardless of what happens after you leave. She looked at him directly. If you break any of those conditions, I will make it my business to ensure your professional reputation suffers consequences you will carry for years. Edmund received this without offense, which was itself a piece of information. Understood and agreed. Agnes came on the 15th day of February, appearing at the entrance before dawn, with the timing that Clara had come to associate with the old woman's particular form of strategic caution. She took in Edmund's presence and his position in the cave seated near the pool, with a map spread across his knees, his feet wrapped, engaged in what was clearly a genuine working conversation with Clara, and she assessed all of it in approximately 8 seconds before sitting down without comment. She brought dried apple slices and a piece of cured pork, and the news that Harold Kemp was still practicing law in Billings confirmed through a letter Agnes had sent to a contact there in December and received a reply to last week. Kemp was 67 years old. He was still sharp. He had apparently kept meticulous records of every will he had ever drawn up, a professional habit that had served him well in disputes before. He would remember your mother's will, Agnes said. He would remember its contents, and he would be willing to testify to them, I believe, if the request came through proper legal channels. She looked at Edmund. A geological surveyor with the Montana Mining Company has standing in territorial court proceedings as a credentialed professional witness. Edmund looked at Clara. Clara looked at Agnes. The railroad will open again in March, Edmund said. Weather permitting, a man could reach Billings in 3 days. Agnes nodded as though this had already been determined, which perhaps it had in the calculating mind she kept behind those sharp eyes. Roland Hatch has been trying to sell the farm since December. No buyers in this weather, but the moment spring breaks, he'll have the land listed. Once the sale proceeds, recovering what your mother left you becomes significantly more complicated. She paused. You have a window. It's not large. Clara measured the situation against the resources available. Edmund's legal standing, Kemp's records, Agnes's witness account, the original will's location if Roland had told the truth about where he'd hidden it. The case was not airtight. It was not even close to certain. But it was more than she'd had in October when she had stood on a frozen sidewalk with 78 cents in one man's coat and nothing else. She was still calculating when the bitterest cold of the entire winter descended without warning on the first day of March. The temperature dropped to 50 below in a matter of hours, the kind of drop that the old-timers in Copper Creek would spend the next decade citing as a reference point for how bad things could actually get. The wind reached velocities that made the pine trees on the ridge sound like a crowd of people screaming all at once. Clara and Edmund sealed the entrance with every layer they had, canvas hide strips, an additional piece of wool blanket Agnes had brought, wedged into the lower gap, and inside the cave, the temperature never dropped below 56 degrees. They could hear the world trying to come apart outside and feel nothing of it except the sound. Agnes did not arrive on the schedule Clara had expected her. She did not come on the first day of the storm or the second. By the morning of the third day, when the wind had dropped enough to make the outside world navigable, Clara understood what the absence meant before she opened the entrance. She understood it the way you understand certain things that you have been preparing yourself for without knowing you were preparing a comprehension that arrived not as shock but as a weight settling into a space that had been waiting to receive it. She found Agnes at the base of the north-facing slope, half covered by a drift that had built around her in the hours since she had stopped moving. She had been coming toward the cave. Her direction was unmistakable, the cave her destination. She was carrying a pack that contained dried meat, a folded blanket, 2 tins of crackers, and a letter sealed with a small bead of red wax pressed with Agnes's thumbnail, which was the only seal she had. Clara knelt in the snow beside the woman who had given her the cave and the knife and the snare wire and the knowledge of Harold Kemp's name and the information about Cole Varner and the map of the hillside and 3 days of teaching and the example of a life lived on independent terms in difficult country. She stayed on her knees for a time that she did not measure. The cold pressed against her from every direction. She did not feel it. She built a cairn over Agnes with stones from the hillside, working with her bare hands in the freezing air until Edmund came out and helped her, neither of them speaking. When it was done, she stood and looked at what they had made and said into the wind, "The earth keeps you warm now." She opened the letter inside near the pool that had never changed temperature through any of it. Agnes's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the intention of being legible. The penmanship of someone who understood this was a document that might matter in ways her previous letters had not. The letter confirmed everything, the real will leaving the farm in all its contents to Clara. Agnes's presence at the signing as witness. The name Roland Hatch had replaced it with a forgery filed after Margaret Ashford's death, and Agnes's certainty about this was not speculation, but direct knowledge. She had seen the real document, and she had later seen the one Roland filed, and they were different in every material way. And at the letter's end, the name again, Harold Kemp Billings, his professional address, his confirmed willingness to speak. Clara read it twice. She folded it carefully and placed it inside the oilcloth that held her father's journal, so that the 2 documents rested against each other. Daniel Ashford's knowledge and Agnes Pruitt's testimony, the 2 foundations on which everything that came next would have to be built. Edmund sat across the pool and watched her face while she read, and when she looked up at him, she saw that he already understood the general shape of what the letter contained, because he had understood the general shape of the situation from the first night he had spent recovering in the cave, listening to the thermal system. His training had taught him to recognize, maintain its perfect indifference to everything the weather was doing outside. "The railroad opens in 3 weeks," he said. 4 at the outside. "Varner will reach this ridge in 2. They looked at each other across the steady rising steam of a spring that had been running since before either of their fathers' had drawn a first breath, and Clara felt the winter contract around her final set of calculations, like limestone around water, pressurizing everything, leaving no space for error, making the next moves as clear and necessary and non-negotiable as the laws of thermodynamics. The window was not large, but it was open, and she had never needed more than open. Cole Varner came on a Wednesday morning 6 days after Agnes's burial cairn had disappeared under fresh snowfall. Clara had been expecting him, not the specific morning, not the exact hour, but the fact of his arrival had been a fixed point in her calculations since Edmund first described him working the eastern ridge. Professional trackers with narrowing search grids did not stop. They reached conclusions. Varner had been reaching this one for weeks, and the particular stillness of the hours before dawn had carried a different quality than the ordinary stillness of the winter, the quality of something about to resolve. She was already awake when the brush screen shifted. She heard it from the sleeping area, the specific sound of the canvas and hide being moved from outside. Not the wind's random pressure, but the deliberate, careful displacement of something being examined by hands that understood what they were looking at. She was on her feet before the sound completed itself, the knife in her grip, her body against the cave wall in the shadow position she had rehearsed so many times in the past weeks that her legs found it without instruction from her conscious mind. Edmund was awake too, across the chamber, a length of iron pipe in his hands that he had been keeping near his bedroll since the letter. Varner came through the tunnel alone, too. He emerged into the chamber and stood at its edge for 30 full seconds without moving his eyes, working the space with the patient, systematic attention of someone trained to read environments before committing to action. He was a lean man in his late 40s, weather-worn in the comprehensive way of people who had spent decades outdoors, his clothing functional and unremarkable, his face carrying the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to conceal what they were thinking. He was not what Clara had imagined when Agnes first spoke his name. She had imagined someone physically imposing someone whose danger announced itself. Varner's danger was quieter than that, more considered the danger of a man who had found people who did not want to be found many times before. He located Clara before he located Edmund, which told her his eyes were good and his threat assessment was calibrated correctly. He looked at the knife, he looked at her face. He did not move toward his coat where she assumed he carried something. Instead, he said, with the flat courtesy of a professional conducting business, "Miss Ashford, Mr. Hatch wants to speak with you." Edmund stepped out of the shadow near the storage alcove, the pipe visible in his hand. Varner's eyes moved to him with the smooth efficiency of a man who had processed this kind of spatial information many times and did not find it alarming, only relevant. Edmund reached into his coat and produced a small leather case, which he opened and held at a distance sufficient for Varner to read without approaching. The certification card inside identified him as a credentialed geological surveyor operating under contract with the Montana Mining Company, a territorial organization with legal standing and administrative relationships with the court system in 3 counties. Edmund Farley, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who had decided on his approach before he stood up. "I am a registered professional witness under territorial statute. Whatever occurs in this space is on record from this moment." Varner read the card. He was quiet for a moment in which he was doing the same kind of calculation Clara did with food supplies and thermal gradients, assessing available resources against required outcomes and determining the most efficient path. A girl with a knife was one kind of problem. A credentialed professional witness with institutional backing was a different kind entirely, the kind that followed you out of the cave and into courtrooms. His jaw shifted slightly. "I'm just delivering a message." "Message delivered." Clara's voice came out without inflection, carrying only what she intended. "Tell Mr. Hatch I know where I'm living and I'm not interested in a conversation. He believes you have property belonging to him. He believes a great many things that aren't true." She held Varner's gaze without aggression and without performance, the flat certainty of someone who has already decided how this ends. "He also knows, or will shortly know, that I have been in contact with an attorney in Billings regarding the terms of my mother's actual will. That information will affect his calculus about what conversations he wants to have and with whom." Something moved in Varner's face that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The slight recalibration of a man who had been briefed on a situation and is now learning the briefing was incomplete. He looked at Edmund again, at the pipe at the certification card still open in Edmund's hand. He looked at the cave itself, the organized habitation, the hot springs steaming in the pale morning light, coming down through the ventilation shaft. He looked at Clara with the expression of someone revising an estimate. "I'll communicate what you've said," he told her, and his voice had shifted. Half a register, the professional courtesy now containing a different quality, the quality of a man managing his own exposure. He moved back toward the tunnel without turning his back, which was a professional habit, and he pulled the brush screen back into place behind him from outside, with the care of someone who had decided not to leave unnecessary traces of his own presence. Clara did not move until the sound of his footsteps on the frozen ground had faded beyond the range of hearing. Then she looked at Edmund, who lowered the pipe and exhaled through his teeth. "He'll tell Roland," Edmund said. "Yes, and Roland will come." She was already calculating. Varner had arrived from the south, which meant he had found an approach route she had not fully accounted for in her perimeter monitoring. Roland would use the same route Varner would show him. The timing depended on how quickly Varner could reach the farm and how quickly Roland, who had spent the winter burning through his reserves in a leaking farmhouse, could make the journey back up a mountain that had defeated better-conditioned men. 2 days, maybe 3 if the cold holds. "We could leave, take the letter, get to town, file with the sheriff before Roland reaches us." Clara thought about this with the same systematic consideration she gave every other logistical problem. The letter from Agnes, the certification of Edmund, as witness the information about Harold Kemp, these were sufficient to initiate a legal inquiry, probably. But an inquiry was not a resolution. Roland could contest delay, use his money and his credit to extend proceedings past the point where Clara's resources could support sustained engagement. The farm would sell in the chaos of a prolonged dispute. She would win the argument and lose the outcome. What she needed was something cleaner. What she needed was Roland himself. "We wait," she said. "He's coming to find something. I'm going to let him find it." Edmund looked at her with the particular quality of attention he had been directing at her work, and her thinking for 3 weeks, the attention of someone who had found an intelligence that consistently operated at a level he respected. He did not argue. He trusted the calculation, which was itself a piece of information that she filed carefully. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Not defensively, Clara was not interested in fortification and hiding, or barricading, or any strategy premised on keeping Roland out. She was interested in context. She wanted Roland to arrive in the cave on her terms in the space she had built, and understood completely surrounded by evidence of the winter she had survived, and he had failed to survive comfortably in a heated house with 2 stoves and his dead wife's savings. She wanted him to see before they spoke what knowledge actually looked like when applied consistently over time. She arranged nothing artificially. She simply made sure the space was precisely what it had been since November: the organized sleeping area, the storage alcove with its carefully managed provisions, the cooking apparatus at the entrance, the pool steady and steaming, the journal open to one of her father's thermal diagrams on the flat rock she used as a table. The cave made its own argument. She only needed to let Roland enter it. Edmund rehearsed his role. He would be present, invisible, the credentialed witness, the institutional weight, but the conversation was Clara's. He would speak only if legally necessary. She had been clear about this, and he had agreed without negotiation, which she appreciated precisely because it required no further thought. Roland came on the 3rd day in the early afternoon alone. She knew he was alone before he appeared because she had been monitoring the approach route from the ventilation shaft, a position from which at a particular angle, a narrow vertical slice of the southern hillside was visible enough to count figures moving through the trees. One figure moving slowly with the labored gait of someone whose body had been fighting a losing battle against cold all winter. Varner was not with him. Whatever Varner's reasons, the witness certification perhaps, or the simpler calculation that Roland Hatch's credit was running out, and an unpaid tracker had better uses for his time, he had delivered the location and withdrawn from the situation. Roland pulled the brush screen aside and came into the tunnel, and Clara heard him breathing before she saw him, the effortful breathing of a man who had lost significant weight and was not yet accustomed to the reduced capacity of his body. He came into the chamber and stopped. He was wearing her father's coat still, but it hung on him now like something borrowed for a costume rather than appropriated for use. He had lost 30 pounds at least since October when the assessment was visible in the coat's shoulders, in the way his face had shed the particular fullness that came from comfortable living, leaving behind a structure that was genuinely angular, older looking, stripped of the authority that weight and warmth and money confer on men in this territory. His eyes were the same as she remembered, but they were operating in a different context now, doing their calculating from a position of substantially reduced leverage. He looked at the cave. He looked at the pool. He stood in the warmth that had maintained itself through the worst winter in territorial memory. Warmth that had asked nothing of the person living inside it except understanding, and something moved across his face that Clara recognized only because she had been watching human beings process difficult information her entire life. It was the expression of a man understanding something he had refused to understand for months, the specific discomfort of a calculation that has been wrong from the beginning, finally resolving into its correct answer. So this is it. His voice was rough, from cold, not quite steady. This is how you did it. Clara stood near the pool. Edmund was visible near the storage alcove present, not speaking. This is how I did it. Roland looked at the pool for a long moment at the steam rising from it, in the same patient column it had been rising in since before either of them existed. He looked at the walls, the organized space the journal opened on the rock. He looked at his own hands, which were red and rough from months of managing firewood in temperatures his stoves couldn't fully counter. I've burned through 60 cords, he said, more money than I can easily account for. The savings are nearly gone. The cattle died in January, all of them 38 head froze in the pasture before I could get them into the barn. He said this not as confession, but as inventory, the flat recitation of a man who had been doing his own calculations and had reached his own conclusions. The farm will sell for a quarter of what it was worth in October if I can find a buyer at all. I know. She had been tracking this through Agnes's reports and Edmund's information from town, and the occasional piece of news she gathered on her own carefully managed supply runs. She had watched Roland's winter unfold from the warmth of the earth, while his version of warmth consumed itself. Roland's eyes moved to Edmund, assessed the pipe the certification case, moved back to Clara. Varner said you'd been in contact with a lawyer in Billings. Harold Kemp. He drew up my mother's real will. He has records. He has memory. She paused, giving the information space to work. I also have a written account from Agnes Pruitt, who witnessed the signing attesting to the will's contents and to the fact that the document filed with the county court after my mother's death did not match what she witnessed. The sound of Roland's breathing changed slightly. A man who has been holding a particular tension for months, releasing it 1 degree at a time. Agnes Pruitt is dead. Her testimony isn't. Edmund's voice came from the alcove, measured carrying the specific weight of professional authority. A written statement from a witness produced before their death and attested to by a credentialed third party is admissible in territorial proceedings. I have certified the document. Miss Ashford has the original. Roland sat down on a boulder near the pool's edge. Not because he was invited to, he was not, but because his legs appeared to have reached the limit of what they were willing to do without rest. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the water moving in the pool, the heat rising from it, the mineral smooth stone around its edge. He was quiet for long enough that the quay's ambient sounds became audible again. The water, the faint creak of the ventilation shaft in the wind, the very slight hiss of steam meeting cooler air. Clara waited. She had learned this from her father, who had written in his journal about the importance of allowing geological processes to complete themselves without interference, that the impulse to accelerate a natural conclusion was almost always counterproductive, that the energy spent forcing a result was energy that could not be spent on what came after. I kept it, Roland said finally. The words came out with the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. The original. I don't know why. I told myself it was insurance, something to hold over someone if I ever needed to, but that's not really it. He reached into the inner pocket of her father's coat with a hand that was not quite steady and produced a folded piece of paper, its creases worn soft from many foldings and unfoldings, the edges beginning to separate at the corners from handling. Maybe I kept it because throwing it away felt too much like admitting what I'd done, and I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. Clara looked at the document in his hand. She did not move to take it. What changed? Roland looked at the pool. The steam rose between them, indifferent. You were supposed to die, he said, and the flatness of it was not cruelty, but truth. The truth of what he had actually believed when he put a 17-year-old girl out in October with nothing. Everyone dies who can't stay warm. That's the rule. That's always been the rule out here. He looked at her, and what was in his face now was not the contempt she had seen in the general store in December, but something rawer, less managed. You stayed warm without anything I couldn't take away. You stayed warm using something I didn't even know existed. A pause. Something your father left you that I couldn't see well enough to steal. She crossed the space between them and took the document from his hand. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the worn creases, and read her mother's handwriting. Margaret Ashford's deliberate cursive, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood the weight of legal language, the weight of a mother's intention set down in ink to protect the person she was leaving behind. The farm, the livestock, the savings, the equipment, all of it to Clara explicitly, unambiguously. The date of signing, the witness signatures, Agnes Pruitt's among them, the same hand that had written the letter Clara carried in her oilcloth bundle. Her mother had tried to protect her. The protection had been erased and then recovered and was now in her hands, and the person who had erased it was sitting 6 feet away in a dead man's coat looking at water rise from the earth with the expression of someone seeing clearly for the first time in a long time. I'll go to the sheriff, Roland said. I'll tell him what I did. I'll tell him about the will and the forgery. All of it. He met her eyes with the particular directness of a man who has moved past the point of managing appearances and is now simply reporting conditions. Not because I've become a good person. I haven't. But because you have enough to bury me in court, and because you could have left me in the snow 3 days ago and I wouldn't be sitting here. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what leaving him in the snow would have made her, the calculation she had run in the seconds before she grabbed his arms and pulled. She thought about her father who had spent 18 hours digging a stranger out of a collapsed mine shaft, because the world only works when people look out for each other, and who had asked for nothing in return, and whose asking for nothing in return had set in motion a chain of events that had kept his daughter alive through the worst winter in territorial history. She thought about what it meant to receive something and pass it forward, and what it meant to take something and hoard it until it destroyed you. The farm will sell, she said. Whatever it brings you, keep. I'm not asking for money. She folded the will and held it. I'm asking for the truth to be on record. That's what my mother wanted. That's what Agnes witnessed. That's what Harold Kemp will confirm when Edmund reaches him. She looked at Roland with the same directness. He was managing no more and no less. You go to Sheriff Breckett and you tell him exactly what you did, and then we're finished with each other. Roland stood from this boulder with the deliberate effort of someone whose body had become unreliable. He buttoned the coat. He had no right to straighten himself inside it with a dignity that was the last thing he had that still belonged to him, and he walked to the tunnel entrance and turned. The journal, he said, your father's personal journal. I took it in October with the professional volumes. I didn't read it. I threw it in the fire with some other papers I was clearing. He paused. I didn't know what it was. Clara looked at the oilcloth bundle in her storage alcove, at the shape of the journal inside it that she had rescued from under the bookcase before she left. She thought about Roland reaching for what he could see and missing what he couldn't, about the distinction between value that was visible and value that required knowledge to recognize. She said nothing. Roland left. His footsteps on the frozen hillside lasted longer than Varner's, had slower, less certain, the sound of a man descending carefully, because a fall now would cost him something he could not afford. Edmund came to stand beside her at the pool. Neither of them spoke for a while. The steam rose between the silence and the limestone ceiling, patient as it had always been. He thought there was another journal, Clara said eventually. There was, Edmund replied. He just couldn't read it. She looked at the cave, at the walls that had held the heat through everything, at the pool that had never changed its temperature by a measurable degree through any of it, at the sleeping area in the storage alcove, in the ventilation shaft, in the entrance seal, and all the small choices that had accumulated over 5 months into a life. The earth had kept her warm. Everything else she had earned. The journey down the mountain was the first time Clara had walked out of the cave without a specific tactical purpose since October. Edmund went with her, his feet recovered enough for careful movement over packed snow, his transit case over one shoulder and his map roll under his arm. They walked without hurrying, and Clara noticed for the first time since autumn the way the late winter light fell across the hillside, different from November light, carrying a quality of thinness that preceded warmth as the light of a system approaching change. Sheriff Brackett's office in Copper Creek was a small frame building beside the land records office, which turned out to be convenient. Roland was already there when they arrived. He had beaten them down the mountain by a route Clara had not known existed, which told her Varner had been thorough in his work before withdrawing. Roland was sitting in the chair across from Brackett's desk, with the posture of a man who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through before the part of him that wanted self-preservation could reverse course. Brackett was a man of 50 who had known Roland Hatch for years, who had attended the same church, who had benefited in small ways from the credit Roland had distributed strategically through the community. He listened to Roland's account with the expression of someone whose categories for understanding a situation are being reorganized while they watch. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had not been given accurate information before and who was receiving it now in a form he could not dismiss from Roland's own mouth, with a certified witness present, with a document in his hand bearing Margaret Ashford's handwriting and Agnes Pruitt's signature. He looked at Clara when Roland finished. She held the look without performance. "I'll need Edmund Farley's formal certification of the witness statement," Brackett said, and his voice had settled into the register of a man doing his job rather than managing a relationship. "And I'll need you to remain available for the county judge when he makes his circuit through. That'll be 6 weeks. "I'll be available," Clara said. Roland was taken into custody before the end of that day. Not dramatically, there was no scene, no crowd, no moment of public theater. He walked with Brackett to the back room of the office, and the door closed. Clara stood outside on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, her canvas sack over her shoulder, the will in the oilcloth bundle against her chest, the same sidewalk she had stood on in October, with 78 cents in one direction to walk. The town looked the same. She was not the same. Edmund left for Billings 4 days later when the railroad opened again with the first tentative break in the cold. He carried certified copies of Agnes's letter, Clara's formal deposition, and a letter of introduction from Sheriff Brackett to Harold Kemp's office. The journey took 3 days, and the conversation with Kemp took 40 minutes because Kemp had indeed kept his records, and his memory was as reliable as Agnes had believed. And he had been waiting in the quiet way of conscientious professionals for someone to ask him the right questions. Kemp's testimony before the county judge 6 weeks later was precise and unambiguous. He had drawn up Margaret Ashford's will in the spring of 1886, 6 months before her death. Its contents were exactly as Agnes had described and Clara had always known. The document filed by Roland Hatch after Margaret's death did not match the document Kemp had drafted. Kemp could account for every material difference and did so in the measured language of a man who had spent 40 years putting words to legal precision and found the truth in this case required very few of them. The verdict was not in doubt. It had not been in doubt since Roland sat down in Brackett's office and opened his mouth, but the judge made it formal in the language the territory required. The farm and its associated property had belonged to Clara Ashford since the moment of her mother's death. Roland's filing had been fraudulent. His subsequent actions, the dispossession of a minor, the hiring of a tracker to locate and intimidate her, The months of deliberate obstruction were added to the accounting. Roland Hatch went to the territorial prison outside Helena for 3 years. He left on a morning in April when the snow had finally begun to retreat from the lower elevations and the creek that ran through Copper Creek was running high and cold with snowmelt. Clara was not present at his departure. She had nothing left to witness there. Cole Varner had disappeared before the arrest warrant was issued. He was a professional, and professionals in his trade maintained contingency plans. Some people said he had gone to California. Others thought north into Canada. Clara did not spend time on the question. He was gone, and the people who had hired him were gone, and the ridge where the cave sat was hers in the way that wild country belongs to people who understand it not through legal title, though she acquired that too, but through the knowledge of its systems and the time spent inside them. She sold the farm in May when the ranching company from the east arrived with their survey teams and their capital and their appetite for land that had survived the worst winter in recorded history and still had productive soil beneath the snow damage. They paid fairly, not generously, but fairly, and Clara accepted the price without negotiation because what she needed the money for was not comfort, but foundation. She bought the parcel of hillside that included the cave, the spring, and the slope above it, where Agnes's cairn stood now visible again as the snow retreated. She bought it through the county land office with Edmund beside her, his certification case on the desk between them, and his signature beside hers on the purchase document. She paid with money that had come ultimately from the farm her father had built and her mother had kept, and Roland had tried to steal money that had made its long journey back to the purpose Margaret Ashford had always intended for it. The burial happened in late May when the ground had softened enough for proper digging. Clara had arranged for a proper grave beside the cairn she had built in the blizzard, and she carved the headstone herself from a piece of the pale limestone that characterized the hillside, the same stone that held the heat from the spring and released it into the cave air, and had been doing so for longer than any human presence in this part of the country. The carving took her 3 days working with tools borrowed from the hardware store and returned with careful thanks. The letters were not perfectly uniform, but they were deeply cut and would last. Agnes Pruitt, 1815 to 1887. She taught others to listen to the earth. The small group of people who came to the burial included Sheriff Breckett, who had revised his understanding of several things since April, and 2 women from town who had known Agnes in her younger years when she had lived closer to Copper Creek, before deciding the hill suited her better than the company. Edmund was there. Clara stood at the grave after the others had moved away in the new warmth of a May afternoon, the hillside around her releasing the smell of thawed earth and the first growth pushing through the dead grass. "I didn't know you long enough," she said to the headstone, "but you knew exactly how long was necessary. You knew what you were doing when you sat on that bench and waited for me to come out of the store." The wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge above, carrying the mineral smell of the spring. Clara listened to it. She had learned over the winter that listening was a practice and not a natural state, that hearing what the earth was actually saying required the same deliberate attention her father had applied to geological survey work presence, without agenda observation, without assumption. She had learned other things. She had learned that the people who saved your life were rarely the people you would have chosen if you'd been given a list in advance. That knowledge passed between people the way heat passed through limestone slowly over time, by contact rather than by transfer, the recipient having to be present and porous and patient for it to work. That the difference between surviving and dying in the Montana winter of 1886 had not been strength or luck or even resources, but the presence or absence of understanding, the presence or absence of a father who wrote things down and hid them under a bookcase and trusted his daughter to find them. She had learned that mercy was not weakness, and that the instinct to leave Roland in the snow would have made her precisely the kind of person she had been determined not to become. She had learned that this distinction mattered more to her than the farm, more than the verdict, more than anything the judge had said in his 6-week circuit. The cabin took the whole summer to build. Edmund designed the pipe system, his professional training in geothermal features applied for the first time to residential heating rather than mineral extraction. And Clara understood the design well enough to contribute improvements her father's journal had suggested in its marginal sketches, the speculative drawings she had spent the winter studying by pool light. They laid pipes in the floor that would carry hot spring water beneath the living space, radiating upward through the board floor in a slow, even warmth that required no stove, no fuel, no daily tending. The earth would do the work. The earth had always been doing the work. They were simply learning to receive it. The cabin was small but well-made, built from timber, cut from the hillside according to a plan that left the existing tree cover intact for insulation and privacy. It sat on the slope above the cave entrance, close enough that Clara could walk to the pool in 2 minutes if she needed the specific comfort of that particular warmth, far enough that the cave retained its character as a separate space. The place Agnes had given her, the place she had survived, and the place where she had read her father's last letter and understood what he had left her. She kept the cave. She kept it the way Agnes had kept it, as something not to be advertised, not to be explained to casual visitors, not to be made into a curiosity. She went there sometimes in winter when she wanted to think without distraction, when the particular quality of that warmth and that silence was what she needed. She kept Agnes's map on the wall of the cave, weighted with one of the sulfur stones from the perimeter she had set against the wolves, a reminder of the specific sequence of problems that had been solved with knowledge. Edmund stayed. This had not been explicitly decided in any conversation Clara could have pointed to as the moment of decision. It had accumulated the way geological formations accumulate by consistent process over time, each day's evidence adding to what had come before, until the formation was simply there, undeniable part of the landscape. He continued his survey work during the summers, ranging across the territory with his instruments and his maps, and returning to the hillside with data that he and Clara would spend the winter evenings analyzing. She had opinions about geothermal features that his professional training had not given him access to, the applied understanding of someone who had spent a winter living inside one, and he had begun incorporating her observations into his survey methodology in ways his senior colleagues would eventually recognize as significant advances. They married in the autumn of 1891 on a day when the hillside above Copper Creek was the color of copper and the air had the first sharpness of approaching cold. The minister was young and new to the territory and did not know the story, which was, Clara reflected, probably appropriate. The story did not require a witness who already knew the ending. Edmund said what he said and meant it. I found you in a cave with a knife in your hand, and you made a decision about who I was that I've been trying to live up to since. You showed me that the most sophisticated technology available to human beings is the understanding of what the earth is already doing and the willingness to work with it instead of against it. I promised myself I would spend the rest of my life learning from you, and I have not had cause to regret that promise once. Clara held his hands in the autumn light and said, I was 17 years old and I had 78 cents in a journal I didn't fully understand yet. The world had decided I was finished. The earth decided otherwise. She looked at him and at the hillside behind him and at the faint column of steam barely visible above the cave entrance, patient and indifferent and continuous. You helped me build something that belongs to us both now. That's not nothing. That's most of everything. The years settled into each other the way seasons do in Montana, distinctly, with full commitment to whatever each one required. They had children who grew up understanding that the floor of their house was warm because the earth beneath it was warm, who learned from their mother to read geological features the way other children learned to read clocks, who absorbed, without being formally taught, the principle that knowledge was the only form of wealth that could not be taxed or stolen or burned through in a single bad winter. The historical society came eventually, as historical societies do, placing a marker near the cave entrance that described the geothermal features of the area in the language of scientific tourism. It did not mention Agnes Pruitt. It did not mention Daniel Ashford or his journal or the winter of 1886 or a girl with a canvas sack in 78 cents who had read thermal equations by pool light until she understood them well enough to survive inside them. Clara read the marker once and thought that this was probably fine. The cave did not need the marker's validation. The spring had been there before and would be there after, indifferent to what the historical society understood about it. In the spring of 1937, Clara Farley was 72 years old and sitting on the porch of the cabin that had been warming itself from below for 5 decades. The pipe system Edmund had designed still functioned, maintained now by a younger man in town who understood enough of the principles to keep it operating, though the original installation had required almost no maintenance in all that time because good systems built on solid understanding tended toward persistence. The floor inside was warm beneath her feet whenever she went in. Her granddaughter Sarah was 15 and sitting on the porch step below her, the particular quality of attention in her posture that Clara recognized as genuine interest. Rather than performed interest, the distinction mattered, and she had always been able to tell the difference. Sarah had her great-grandfather's quality of engagement with the physical world, the instinct to understand mechanisms rather than simply use them. "Tell me about the cave," Sarah said. "The whole thing from the beginning." Clara looked at the hillside above where a thread of steam was visible in the cool spring air, faint against the blue of the morning sky. She thought about October 1886, about a frost-covered morning in a canvas sack, in a decision to fold the quilt rather than leave it. About a bench outside a general store and an old woman with eyes like knife blades asking if she was afraid of the dark. "The winter of 1886 was the worst in territorial history," she began. "The snow started in November and didn't stop until March. The temperatures dropped to 40 below. People burned their furniture to stay warm." She paused, feeling the warmth rising through the porch boards from the pipes below. "I didn't burn anything. The earth kept me warm." Sarah looked up at her with the interest of someone who already knew this was more than a story about weather. Clara reached into her coat, the same motion her father had made when he wanted to share something important. The same reach, and produced the oilcloth bundle. She unwrapped it with the care of 5 decades of careful handling and held the journal out to her granddaughter. The leather was dark with age, the binding worn at the corners, the oilcloth creased from many foldings. But the pages inside were still clear, the ink still legible, the thermal diagram still precise. Sarah took it with the instinctive respect of someone receiving something she recognizes as significant before she fully understands why. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. "Your great-grandfather wrote that," Clara said. "Everything he understood about the way heat moves through the earth, the way the earth stores energy and releases it, the way water carries warmth from the deep places to the surface and gives it to whatever's there to receive it." She watched Sarah's hands on the journal cover. "I read it the winter I was 17 in a cave by the light of a hot spring. I read it until I could use it, and using it kept me alive. What if I don't understand all of it?" Sarah's voice had the quality of someone asking a real question, not a polite one. Clara smiled, the same smile she had given Roland Hatch in Harding's General Store on a December morning when he needed her to be suffering, and she wasn't the smile of someone who knows something that the world has not yet managed to take from them. "Then you'll learn. The journal isn't a test. It's an invitation." She looked at the hillside, at the steam rising from the place where the earth had been giving its warmth away for longer than any human reckoning. Knowledge doesn't diminish when you pass it on. It multiplies. Agnes Pruitt knew that. Your great-grandfather knew it. It's the one thing that works against entropy. Sarah opened the journal to its first page. Clara watched her begin to read, watched the particular quality of attention that reading something genuinely new for the first time produces in a young face, the slight forward lean, the stillness, the eyes moving across the page with that specific purposeful speed that meant comprehension was happening and not just recognition. The spring kept flowing. It had been flowing through the founding of the territory and through the winter that nearly erased a generation of cattle, and through a court proceeding and a marriage, in the raising of children, and all the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life built on a foundation that the earth provided free of charge to anyone who understood enough to build there. It would be flowing after Sarah and after Sarah's children, and the children after them carrying heat from the deep places to the surface, with the patient indifference of a process that required no human participation to continue and only benefited from human intelligence when that intelligence arrived humble enough to work with what was already there. Clara sat on her warm porch in the spring light and listened to the hillside and felt for the first time in 50 years something very close to the feeling she had had on the first night in the cave. The feeling of being exactly in the right place, exactly in the right relationship with what surrounded her, warm in the way that the earth warms things from below and from inside and without end.